Welcome back to Talk Tensors. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a paper that's really tackling a huge challenge, and that is making sure that distributed systems, play by the rules of GDPR, particularly when we're talking about personal data. Those systems where data and processing are scattered all over the place, like in big collaborations, things like data marketplaces, scientific grids, all that good tech that's powering the future.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting about this paper is that it's trying to bring together the cutting edge data tech with the very human need for privacy, right? It's proposing a system to automatically check if data processing in these, distributed systems is actually GDPR compliant.
That's a pretty big deal. Can you give us kind of a quick overview of why this is so important?
Sure. Imagine you have a system where the data is spread across different servers, different organizations, maybe even different countries.
Yeah.
Making sure that everything is GDPR compliant in that kind of setup is incredibly complex. You need to track who is accessing what data and for what purpose. And you need to make sure it all aligns with the regulations. Doing that manually is practically impossible at scale.
Yeah.
So automation is key.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, before we get into the details of the paper solution, can you give us some context, like what led up to this research?
Well, traditional access control systems, they mainly just focus on who can access data, right? They check your credentials, your role, and decide if you have permission to read, write, or modify certain files. But that's not enough for GDPR.
Because GDPR cares about the why, right?
Yeah.
The purpose behind accessing the data.
You got it.
Yeah.
GDPR's purpose limitation principle states that personal data can only be processed for the specific purpose it was collected for.
Right.
You can't just repurpose data for something else without a valid legal basis.
So if a company collects my data to deliver an order, they can't turn around and use it for targeted advertising without my consent.
Exactly. And that's where things get really tricky in distributed systems with multiple actors involved, each with their own purposes. It becomes very difficult to track and verify compliance.
So this paper is trying to bridge that gap between traditional access control and GDPR's purpose-centric approach.
Yes. The authors are proposing a new model called purpose-based access control. And it goes beyond just checking who is accessing the data. It also looks at why they're accessing it.
Interesting. So how does that actually work?
At the heart of their system are these things called purpose graphs. Imagine a map that lays out all the data in the system. Who owns it? What actions can be performed on it? But the really important part is that it maps out the purpose behind each action.
So it's not just about access, it's about intent.
Exactly. The purpose graph defines relationships between purposes, whether one is more specific than another, if they're compatible, and so on. It's like building a digital map of intentions for every piece of data.
That's pretty clever, but how do you actually use this map to enforce anything?
That's where the normative reasoning engine comes in. You feed it the purpose graph along with some specific claims about the situation, like the legal basis for processing the data.
Okay.
And the engine uses logic to determine if a requested action is actually allowed under GDPR.
So it's like a digital judge evaluating each request against a set of rules and intentions. But how does this play out in a real-world scenario?
The paper uses the example of a telecom company, like the Dutch company KPN, which is legally obligated to allow wiretaps for criminal investigations.
Right.
So they have to balance their contractual obligations to customers, which allows them to process data for service delivery with their obligations to law enforcement.
That's a tricky situation. How would purpose graphs and this reasoning engine help?
So in this case, you'd map out all the actors, KPN, the customer's law enforcement. You define their purposes, the data involved, and then let the system decide if a wiretap request is allowed based on all the rules in play.
So it would check if the wiretap purpose is compatible with the original purpose of collecting the data and if it fits within the legal framework. But this KPN example is just one application, right?
Of course, the real game changer lies in the potential to automate purpose. Understanding.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to teach a machine to understand the nuances of human intention behind code.
Wow. Yeah.
That's the kind of challenge that we are facing.
That brings up a lot of questions. Can we actually automate figuring out the purpose of a piece of software? How do you teach an algorithm to understand intent?
Those are exactly the types of questions that make this research so compelling. It's laying the groundwork for a future where data processing isn't just powerful, but it's also ethically sound and aligned with our privacy rights.
This all sounds really promising, but are there any limitations to the system?
Well, the paper acknowledges that this is just a framework, and there are still significant challenges to overcome.
Great.
One major hurdle is dealing with conflicting interpretations of GDPR.
What happens if a company claims a purpose is compatible with GDPR, but a privacy authority disagrees?
That is a great question, and one that the paper leaves open for further research.
This has been a fascinating deep dive so far. We've talked about the need for purpose-based access control in distributed systems. The concept of purpose graphs the role of a reasoning engine, and even a real-world example with KPN. We've also touched upon some of the challenges like automating purpose understanding and dealing with conflicting interpretations of GDPR.
Exactly. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how this system could be integrated into existing data infrastructure. And we'll discuss some of the practical implications of this research. So far, we've been talking about the theoretical framework of this purpose-based access control system. But the paper also gets into the nitty-gritty of how this could actually be implemented, in a real-world setting.
Okay, let's get technical. How do they see this working in practice?
They use a standard called XACML, which basically acts as a blueprint for access control systems. It defines the components and how they interact.
So it's like a universal language for data security.
Yeah, precisely. And the paper shows how their purpose-based reasoning system could fit right into this existing architecture.
That's smart. You wouldn't need to completely redo your entire data infrastructure to implement this.
Right. It's like adding a new module to an existing system, and they specifically address the distributed part of the problem. Remember, we're dealing with systems where the data and processing are spread across different locations.
Right. Think of data marketplaces where data sets are bought and sold, or research collaborations where data is analyzed in labs around the world. How do you actually enforce privacy when everything's so interconnected?
The paper outlines a few different scenarios, and it all boils down to how the key players interact with the system, the controller, the processor, and the data subject.
Okay, let's break that down. Who are these players and what are they responsible for in this distributed data game?
So the controller is essentially the decision maker. The purpose of data processing, the processor is the one who actually carries out the actions on the data.
And then, of course, we have the data subject, the person whose information is being processed.
Exactly. And these roles might be spread across different organizations, which makes things even more complex. Imagine a research project where one university collects the data, another analyzes it, and the data subjects are patients at a hospital.
Yeah, that does sound complicated. How do our purpose graphs and reasoning engine fit into this multiplayer scenario?
So each player contributes to the purpose graph by providing qualifications. The controller would specify the legal basis for the processing. The data subject might give their consent.
It's like everyone's working together to build this detailed map of data and intent.
Exactly. This information, combined with the purpose graph, is then fed into the reasoning engine whenever there's a request to access or use data.
So the reasoning engine is like a bouncer at a data club, checking everyone's credentials and intentions before letting them in.
Yeah, a perfect analogy. What's even more impressive is that the paper describes how this system could be used not just for ex ante enforcement, preventing unauthorized access in the first place, but also for ex post scenarios like audits.
So it's not just preventative, it can also help verify compliance after the fact.
Precisely. The system keeps a log of all the decisions made and the qualifications that led to those decisions.
Yeah.
So it creates an audit trail that privacy authorities or even data subjects could use to make sure everything was done by the book.
It's like having a built-in accountability system that seems really valuable.
It is. It shifts the focus from simply trusting companies to actually being able to check that they're handling data responsibly.
This all sounds promising, but I'm sure there are challenges to implementing such a system. What do the authors highlight as potential roadblocks?
One big challenge is the garbage in, garbage out problem. The system is only as good as the information it receives.
Right.
If the input is inaccurate or misleading, the system won't work properly.
Like putting the wrong numbers into a calculator, you'll get an answer, but it won't be the right one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why clear standards and guidelines for defining and checking these qualifications are so important. Another hurdle is just the complexity of GDPR itself.
It's a dense regulation even for experts.
Absolutely. And remember, this paper only focuses on a part of GDPR requirements, mostly those related to purpose limitation. There's a lot more to address within the full scope of the regulation.
So lots of potential, but also lots of work to be done.
Definitely. This is just the start of a much bigger conversation about building privacy-respecting data systems, in this age of distributed everything.
This paper seems less about a finished product and more about a vision for the future. What are the next steps in actually developing this system?
Well, there are still a lot of open questions. One crucial area for future research is figuring out how to scale this approach. We've been talking about pretty simple examples, But real-world scenarios can involve massive data sets and complex interactions between lots of different actors.
So how do you make sure that the system can handle that increase in scale? What about the computing power needed to deal with all those purpose graphs and reasoning tasks?
Those are really important considerations. Researchers are going to have to explore optimization techniques and maybe even leverage advancements in distributed computing to make the system scalable for real-world applications.
And let's not forget about user experience. Can you imagine having to manually put in all the details for every piece of data and every action in a huge distributed system?
Oh, that would be a nightmare. So developing user-friendly interfaces will be key to making the system accessible and usable for data controllers, processors, and even data subjects.
So it's not just about the technical stuff, it's also about designing a system that people can actually understand and use effectively.
Exactly. User-centered design is going to be really important for making sure that this kind of system is adopted.
That makes sense. So far, we've been focusing on the technical side of this research, but what about the human element?
This is where things get really interesting. The paper recognizes how important human expertise is in this system. It's not just about algorithms and logic. It's also about the judgment and experience of privacy experts who understand all the nuances of GDPR.
So it's not just about automating everything. It's about finding the right balance between human oversight and technological capabilities.
Exactly. Privacy experts would play a big role in defining those purpose graphs, setting the rules for the reasoning engine, and ultimately making sure that the system aligns with GDPR.
This system seems to be a mix of cutting-edge technology and human expertise. But how do we make sure that the human element doesn't bring in bias or subjectivity into the decision-making?
That's a crucial question the paper suggests, using an expert system, which lets multiple privacy experts share their knowledge and perspectives. This helps reduce the risk of individual bias and ensures a more balanced and objective approach.
So it's like having a panel of judges instead of just one, which helps to avoid potential conflicts of interest or different interpretations of the law.
Precisely. The expert system allows for a more robust decision-making process, drawing on the collective wisdom of multiple experts.
But wouldn't that also make the system more complex? Managing input from multiple experts, resolving disagreements, and making sure everyone interprets GDPR the same way, it sounds like a big challenge.
Absolutely. Designing and implementing a good expert system is not easy. Researchers will need to look at different approaches like consensus mechanisms, weighted voting systems, or even machine learning to effectively gather and interpret expert input.
It seems like this research brings up more questions than it answers, but that's often what happens with groundbreaking work. It challenges us to think differently about the problems we're facing.
I completely agree. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the wider implications of this research and talk about what it could mean for the future of data privacy in the age of distributed systems. We've talked about a lot in this deep dive, purpose-based access control purpose graphs, all the complexities of making such a system work in a distributed environment. It feels like this research is pushing the limits of data privacy.
Yeah, it is. And as we've discussed, there's still so much more to figure out, from those technical challenges like scaling and user interface design to those ethical questions about human expertise and potential bias. But even with all these open questions, I think this research really gives us a glimpse into a future where data processing isn't just powerful and efficient, it's also very respectful of individual privacy.
It is a really exciting thought. But, I'm curious, what are the bigger implications of this work? How could this change how we think about data privacy in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question.
This paper could really be a catalyst for change. It shows us we need a new way of thinking about data governance in these distributed systems. It's not enough to rely on traditional access control that only focuses on who has access to what.
Right.
We need to think about purpose, making sure the data is used responsibly and ethically.
So this research is pushing for a more purpose-aware approach to data governance.
Exactly. And this has implications not only for how we design these systems, but also for the legal side of things. GDPR is just one example. We're seeing similar privacy regulations popping up all over the world, and they all emphasize purpose limitation and data minimization. This research provides a framework for how to turn those principles into actual mechanisms within these complex systems.
It's like they're providing a blueprint for building privacy-respecting data systems for the future.
Precisely. And this blueprint isn't just for tech people. It's for policymakers, legal experts, ethicists, everyone involved in shaping how data is collected, processed, and used in our world. Everything is so interconnected. This research calls for a collaborative effort to ensure that as technology advances, we don't leave behind fundamental rights.
That leads to a really important question. How do we make this vision a reality? What needs to happen to move from research to implementation?
There are a few key steps. First, we need more research.
Yeah.
We need to answer those open questions that we've been talking about, like scaling the system, designing user-friendly interfaces, and dealing with potential biases in the expert system.
Right.
Second, collaboration is essential. Technologists, legal experts, policymakers, and ethicists all need to work together to turn these research findings into practical solutions and guidelines that the industry can use.
So we need to bridge the gap between theory and practice.
Yeah, exactly. And third, awareness is crucial.
Huh.
We need to educate everyone involved, data controllers, processors, and even the people whose data is being used, about the importance of purpose-based access control and empower them to demand systems that respect their privacy. This research is a great tool for advocacy and education. You can start a conversation about the future of data privacy.
This research really makes us rethink our relationship with data. It's not just about protecting information, it's about ensuring that data is used in the right way ethically and for the reasons it was originally collected.
And that's a perfect way to put it. This research highlights that data isn't just something to be exploited. It's a powerful resource that we need to handle carefully and with respect to the people it represents. It's a call to action for all of us to really think about the data systems we build and use and make sure they reflect our values and protect the right to privacy.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
I would say the future of data privacy isn't about building walls and restricting access. It's about creating systems that are transparent, accountable, and focused on purpose. This research gives us a vision of what that future could be like, and it's up to all of us to make it happen.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of purpose-based access control and GDPR compliance in distributed systems. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going about data privacy.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
And to our listeners, if you want to learn more about this topic, we'll have links to the research paper and other resources in the show notes. Thanks for listening.